When I was 15, I came home from school and saw 3 big yard cleanup bags sitting on the front porch, tied tight at the top. Next to them were 2 taped cardboard boxes with my handwriting on the sides from old school projects. My mom stood in the doorway like nothing was unusual and said Leonard didn't want a teenager in the house anymore, and that if she wanted the relationship to work, he came first. I remember staring at those bags for a second too long before it really hit me that everything from my bedroom was inside them, and that I didn't live there anymore. My name is Marina Caldwell. I'm 29. I grew up in Mobile, Alabama, in a house that never stayed the same for very long. My father had disappeared when I was still pretty young enough that the details were always fuzzy around the edges. I remember there being arguments before he left, doors closing harder than usual, my mom moving around the kitchen with this tight, clipped energy like everything was slightly off balance. And then one day he was just gone. No explanation that made sense to a kid, no long goodbye. After that, it was just me and my mom, Angela. For a while I thought that meant things would settle down. 2 people, 1 house, a routine, but that's not really how it worked. My mom started dating pretty quickly, and the boyfriends came and went in this steady rotation that eventually started to feel normal. At first I'd notice the small things. A different car parked outside for a few weeks. A toothbrush that didn't belong to us sitting next to the sink. A man's jacket hanging over the back of a chair that had never been there before. Then, gradually, the house would shift around him. It was never announced like some big change. It was quieter than that, subtle at first. The TV shows we watched in the living room would suddenly be whatever he wanted to watch. Dinner schedules moved later because he worked late. The music playing in the kitchen would switch to whatever station he liked. I learned early that the atmosphere of the house depended on whoever my mom was dating at the time. Some of them stayed a few weeks, some lasted a couple months, a few stretched closer to a year, and each time one left, the house would reset for a little while, just me and my mom again. Things would feel calm for a bit. Then someone new would appear, and everything would quietly rearrange itself all over again. When I was younger, I tried really hard to be polite about it. I'd say hello, keep out of the way, try not to create problems. I think part of me believed that if I was easy enough to live with, none of the adults around me would ever see me as a complication. But even as a kid, you can feel when the center of gravity in your own home isn't really you. There's this subtle shift that happens when an adult starts prioritizing someone else's comfort over everything else. Conversations lower when you walk into a room. Plans change without explanation. Doors start closing more often. It wasn't something my mom ever said out loud. She never looked at me and explained the rules. But over time, the message still settled in pretty clearly. Whoever she was dating at the moment was the priority. Their opinions mattered more, their comfort mattered more, their moods shaped the entire house. And my role, without anyone directly saying it, was to adapt. Stay quiet. Don't make things harder. Don't get in the way. By the time Leonard came into the picture, that pattern had already been part of my life for years. I just didn't realize yet that he would be the one who pushed it all the way to the point where there was no room left for me at all. By the time I was a sophomore in high school, the routine of adapting to whoever my mom was dating had become almost automatic. I didn't ask many questions. I mostly stayed in my lane, school, homework, keeping my room relatively neat, trying not to create friction in a house where the atmosphere could change depending on who was around. The day everything changed didn't feel dramatic at first. It was just a normal afternoon after school. I remember the bus ride home being completely ordinary. Kids talking too loudly, someone playing music from their phone in the back, the driver reminding everyone to stay seated as we turned into my neighborhood. When I stepped off the bus and started walking up the short driveway toward the house, something looked off. At first, it didn't register what I was seeing. There were 3 big yard cleanup bags sitting on the porch near the front door, the kind people use for leaves or branches. Next to them were 2 cardboard boxes sealed with thick strips of packing tape. For a second, I assumed my mom had been cleaning out the garage or something. But as I walked closer, that vague feeling in my stomach started tightening. Because one of the bags had a small tear near the top, and through that tear I could see fabric. Not random fabric, my fabric. A sweatshirt I wore all the time, the sleeve twisted against the plastic like it had just been shoved in there quickly. I slowed down without even realizing I had. The closer I got, the clearer everything became. The boxes had writing on them, my handwriting from old-school labels I'd taped to the sides of things in my room. One of them had a corner crushed slightly inward, and inside that opening I could see the edge of a spiral notebook and the corner of a photo frame. My stuff. All of it mixed together. Clothes, school things, random pieces of my room. Packed. I just stood there on the porch for a moment, staring at it, trying to process what I was looking at. There's this strange pause your brain goes through when something doesn't make sense yet, when it's obvious something is wrong but the explanation hasn't landed. Then the front door opened. My mom, Angela, was standing there like she had been expecting me. She didn't look upset, she didn't look nervous. If anything, her expression was almost neutral, like this was a conversation she had already settled in her head. I remember her leaning slightly against the doorframe while she talked, arms loosely crossed, explaining the situation in a tone that sounded calm enough that for a moment it made the whole thing feel unreal. She told me Leonard had made it clear he didn't want a teenager living in the house anymore. And if the relationship was going to work, she needed to respect that. She said it plainly, like it was a practical decision. Like rearranging furniture. At some point during that explanation, she mentioned that I would be moving in with my Aunt Denise. Denise lived in Daphne, about 40 minutes away, and apparently the plan had already been arranged. It wasn't presented as a discussion. It was more like she was explaining the logistics of something that had already been decided. I remember looking from her face to the bags again, trying to connect the two things. My belongings tied up in yard bags on the porch. My mother calmly explaining that someone else's comfort in the house mattered more than me being there. There wasn't yelling. There wasn't some dramatic moment where voices were raised. Just this quiet realization settling in, piece by piece, that the place I had walked into every day after school wasn't mine anymore. There wasn't a long goodbye after that conversation. Once it was clear the decision had already been made, everything moved with this quiet, uncomfortable efficiency. The bags and boxes that had been sitting on the porch were eventually moved into the back of a car so they could be taken to my aunt's house. I remember watching that happen with this strange detachment, like my brain hadn't fully caught up to what was unfolding yet. The house behind me still looked exactly the same as it had that morning when I left for school. Same front yard, same windows, same porch. But the feeling of belonging there had already been stripped away. The drive to my Aunt Denise's house in Daphne took about 40 minutes, but it felt longer than that. I spent most of the time looking out the window as the neighborhoods changed and the roads stretched out toward the bay. Neither of us talked very much. There were a couple moments where my mom said practical things, small details about Denise expecting me, about how this would probably be better for everyone. The way she phrased it made it sound like some kind of sensible adjustment. I didn't argue. At 15, you don't always have the language for that kind of moment. There's shock first, then a kind of quiet survival instinct that tells you to just get through the next step. By the time we pulled into Denise's driveway, the sun was already getting lower in the sky. Denise's house wasn't big, but it had a lived-in, steady feeling that was immediately different from the tension I had grown used to at home. She opened the door when we arrived, and I remember noticing the way her attention went straight to me before anything else, like she was checking to make sure I was okay before worrying about the logistics of bags and boxes. The transition itself wasn't dramatic. There were no big speeches or emotional scenes. My things were brought inside and stacked along one wall of the living room. At first, there wasn't really a separate space for me yet. Denise had a pull-out love seat in the living room, and that's where I slept during those first nights. The love seat folded out into a thin mattress that dipped slightly in the middle. I remember the faint smell of laundry detergent on the sheets and the way the springs underneath creaked when I shifted during the night. It wasn't comfortable in the way a normal bedroom would be. But it was a place to sleep. And more importantly, it wasn't a place where I felt like I was being tolerated under conditions. Denise never treated me like I was some temporary inconvenience she had agreed to handle. She moved around the house like my presence was something she had already factored into her life. After a while, maybe a few weeks, maybe a little longer, she cleared out a small storage area toward the back of the house. It had been holding boxes and old seasonal decorations, things like that. She made space in there for a narrow folding cot. It wasn't a real bedroom. The walls were plain, and there wasn't much room beyond the cot and a small stack of my belongings. But it was mine. A defined space where I could close the door and keep my things without worrying they would suddenly be packed up again. What stayed with me the most about those years wasn't the size of the room or the furniture. It was the steadiness. Denise didn't make grand gestures about saving me or stepping in. She didn't constantly bring up the situation or ask me to explain how I felt about it. She simply built a routine around me being there. Dinner happened at the same time most nights. School questions were asked in a normal way. If something needed to be handled, forms, rides, basic life stuff, she handled it without making me feel like I owed her something for it. That kind of quiet stability might not look like much from the outside. But when you've just been removed from your own home like that, the absence of tension becomes its own kind of safety. It wasn't just the move itself that cut me, it was the story that followed. For months after I settled into Denise's house, I started hearing bits and pieces from relatives who would casually ask about why I'd left or why I hadn't been around for family events. At first, I brushed it off. Maybe people just assumed I had gone to live with Denise because she had more room or that it was something temporary. But the pieces didn't add up. The questions were pointed. They assumed there was conflict. And slowly, it became clear. My mother was telling everyone a completely different story. According to her, I hadn't been pushed out. I had stormed out of the house. I had been rebellious, impossible to manage, someone she couldn't handle anymore. That version of events painted me as the problem, my behavior as the catalyst for my own displacement. I remember the first time a relative asked me about the incident with this assumed attitude, expecting me to explain my so-called meltdown. I just stared at them, unable to process how everything had been flipped. The bags on the porch, the boxes packed with my childhood belongings in her story, somehow all of that was my fault. Hearing family members recounting her version, nodding along, asking questions in that polite but curious tone, cut in a way that no confrontation at home ever could. It wasn't the loud argument or the dramatic shouting I had imagined. It was quiet, soft-spoken, polite, yet each utterance was a nail in the coffin of my own truth. The people who should have known me, or at least given me the benefit of the doubt, had accepted the narrative of a teenager who had thrown herself out of the only home she had. I felt erased. Quietly, invisibly erased. There was no shouting, no fight to witness, no public disgrace that could be challenged or corrected. Instead, the shame and blame were subtle, interwoven into everyday conversation, like little threads tightening around my identity, reshaping it without me realizing at first. I was being framed in the minds of people I thought would protect me, and it left a hollow, gnawing ache. It made every interaction outside Denise's house tense. Every phone call from family, every greeting at a holiday meal carried the undercurrent of judgment that wasn't mine but had been assigned to me. I remember clenching my hands, forcing a smile, and nodding as someone recounted what had happened the day I left. My stomach would drop every time I heard her words replayed. Marina just couldn't get along, she was out of control. The cruelty wasn't loud, it was insidious. It was the betrayal that came not from someone confronting me directly, but from someone quietly rewriting my reality for everyone else. A decade later, I could still feel the sting of being blamed for my own displacement, the second betrayal, far subtler than the bags on the porch but far deeper in its reach. It was one thing to be sent away. It was another to have your story stolen while you were still processing the first wound. The years that followed were quiet, but not in a comforting way. Birthdays passed without cards, without calls, without her voice on the other end of the line. Holidays came and went, Thanksgiving dinners, Christmas mornings, even the small, mundane family traditions that I had once clung to, and Angela was nowhere to be found. At first, I held out hope that maybe she'd come around, that she'd call one day and admit she'd been wrong or at least check in. But that hope faded slowly, day by day, as the years added up. School milestones came and went. Every time there was a recital, an awards ceremony, or some small recognition at school, I would glance toward the empty seats where she might have been. I learned to brace for the absence. There were teachers and friends who noticed, some asking why my mom wasn't present, and I would just shrug or mumble that she had her reasons. It became easier to tell myself that I didn't need her there. But inside, the hurt lingered, sharp and quiet, a constant reminder of what I had lost. The hardest one, maybe, was my high school graduation. I had pictured it countless times in my mind over the years, her in the audience, smiling, clapping, proud. But that day, as I walked across the stage to receive my diploma, she was nowhere to be found. Not a single trace. The only family member who showed up was my cousin Kayla. I remember spotting her in the sea of faces, her hands clapping and her voice cheering, and it was bittersweet. Relief that at least someone cared, coupled with the aching reality that the person who should have been the first to celebrate with me had deliberately removed herself from that moment. Kayla was a constant in those years. She filled in the gaps that Angela left behind, not by taking her place, but simply by showing that care could exist without conditions. She asked how school was, how I was feeling, checked in when I had minor setbacks. I clung to that kind of stability like a lifeline. It reminded me that not all relationships were defined by betrayal, and that trust could exist, even if fragile. Outside of family, I began slowly carving out my own space in the world. Part-time jobs, school responsibilities, small freedoms, and adult responsibilities all built up around me. It was exhausting at first, managing everything on my own, but it also gave me a sense of autonomy I hadn't really felt before. I learned to pay bills, manage schedules, make choices without asking permission, and most importantly, learn that I could rely on myself when no one else would. I also became fiercely protective of that independence. The absence of my mother had taught me a lesson I couldn't ignore. No one would fight for me the way I needed unless I learned to stand up for myself. Over time, this quiet life became my foundation, a life of small routines, stable work, and trusted friends who respected my boundaries. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't perfect, but it was mine. And even with all of that, the shadow of her absence lingered, shaping every interaction, every thought about what family was supposed to mean. Those years of silence weren't just about missing birthdays. They were about the long, slow erosion of a sense of belonging, a truth I would carry with me even as I built my adult life. It was 13 years after I'd first been pushed out that she appeared again, suddenly, in a place I thought she'd never touch. I was working at the outpatient clinic, the same one I'd chosen for its stability, its predictable rhythm, the kind of place where every patient and colleague relied on order and trust. I was behind the reception desk, sorting through some files, when I first noticed a woman lingering near the entrance, watching the staff with this strange, determined air. Before I could even register who it might be, she approached the front desk and introduced herself. "Hello," she said, her voice calm but insistent. "I'm Angela, Marina's mother." The words landed like a hammer blow. My stomach dropped. My hands froze for a second as she continued, telling the receptionist she just wanted another chance with her daughter, that she wanted to reconnect, to make things right. It was almost surreal. The same person who had erased me from her life, who had packed up my childhood and abandoned me, was now standing in my professional space, presenting herself as someone who deserved access to me again. The calmness of her tone made it worse, like she believed this was a reasonable, normal interaction. Staff around me exchanged uncertain glances. Some were polite, some hesitant, but no one knew the history. From the outside, it could have seemed like a harmless mother trying to reach out after years apart. I remember taking a slow, controlled breath and stepping aside to collect my thoughts. My first instinct was disbelief, then anger, then this tight knot of confusion. How does someone just reappear after more than a decade and act as if the past can be so easily rewritten? It was like a ghost had walked back into the room with her own version of history fully intact, expecting the present to bend around it. The receptionist handled the situation cautiously, trying not to escalate, but I could feel every subtle shift in the room, the tension, the unspoken questions. My coworkers had no idea what had really happened, and I couldn't tell them. Not yet. Not without opening wounds that weren't mine to explain in a professional setting. She lingered just long enough to make her intentions clear. She wanted contact. She wanted to be involved in my life again. She framed it as a mother's yearning, as if 13 years of silence and absence could be excused by a simple admission of desire. There was no acknowledgement of the choices she had made, no recognition of the years she had lost, no apology that addressed the real harm, just a claim that she wanted a second chance. When she finally left the reception area, my hands were shaking slightly, and it took me a long moment to regain composure. The room around me felt smaller, somehow, as though her sudden presence had expanded into every corner, reminding me of everything I had survived. But it also reminded me of how much I had built on my own, the stability I had carved out for myself without her, the life she had no right to just walk back into. I stepped out of the reception area, letting the door close softly behind me, and found myself face to face with her. Angela stood there, looking calm, or at least trying to look calm, but her eyes betrayed something else. Hesitation, a flicker of discomfort, like she hadn't anticipated meeting me directly in this context. I took a slow breath, forcing myself to keep my tone steady. My hands were at my sides, but my body felt tense, braced for the conversation I knew I had to have. "Mom," I said, my voice low but firm, "I need to be clear. You cannot keep showing up here. If you continue, I will have the building manager issue a formal trespass notice." The words felt heavier than I expected, though I had rehearsed similar lines in my mind for years. She blinked, just once, and for a moment I thought she might laugh or try to dismiss me with some excuse. But instead, her mouth pressed into a thin line, and her expression shifted. There was the barest quiver in her jaw, a flicker of disbelief in her eyes. She opened her mouth as if to respond, but no words came at first. Her hands fidgeted slightly at her sides, and I noticed a subtle tightening of her shoulders, the way her posture shifted from casual to defensive. For the first time in years, I saw hesitation there, not the calm certainty she had always projected, not the quiet entitlement that had sent me packing at 15, but a real, human discomfort. I just wanted to see her," she finally said, her voice uneven, almost breaking. "I understand that," I said, keeping my tone even, "but this isn't how you reconnect. This is my workplace. I'm asking you to respect my boundaries. No more appearances here. If that doesn't happen, there will be formal consequences." She flinched slightly at the word formal, and I could see the cognitive shift happening in real time, the narrative she had lived in for herself for 13 years suddenly cracking against the reality of someone who had built a life apart from her influence. The disbelief on her face wasn't anger, exactly. It was more like a stunned recalibration, realizing that the past she thought she could rewrite now had concrete limits she couldn't cross. I stayed quiet for a few beats, letting the words settle between us. The air was taut, filled with unspoken history, with years of absence compressed into that one moment of confrontation. I could feel my own pulse, steadying as I held my ground. This wasn't a negotiation. This was a boundary, one I had earned, one I had every right to enforce. She glanced toward the clinic doors, a flicker of indecision crossing her face, and then, slowly, she stepped back. Not a word more. Not another attempt at charm or pleading. Just a stiff nod, and then she turned away, leaving me standing there in the sunlight, the weight of 13 years of silence pressing quietly but firmly against her absence. It was Aunt Denise who finally filled in the pieces I hadn't known were missing, and the revelation hit harder than I expected. We were sitting in her kitchen one evening, the room quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the soft ticking of a wall clock. She leaned forward, her hands folded tightly, and told me that relatives had started asking her strange questions about why I wasn't in my mother's life anymore. At first, Denise had brushed them off, assuming it was idle curiosity. But then she started noticing a pattern. Phone calls from distant cousins, awkward comments from family friends, and even messages from people I hadn't spoken to in years, all hinting that something about my absence needed clarifying. Denise took a deep breath and explained it. Angela had begun telling a completely new version of events, one where she was the hero. In this story, she hadn't kicked me out at 15. No, according to her, she had sent me to Denise's house to protect me from Leonard. Supposedly, he was dangerous, or at least threatening enough that social services might have gotten involved. In her narrative, I hadn't been abandoned. I had been saved. Hearing it aloud made my stomach turn. I could feel the edges of my chest tightening, that same pit-of-the-stomach sensation I'd felt the day I saw the bags on the porch. Years of absence, of birthdays and graduations missed, of my life quietly built without her, were now being overwritten. And worse, relatives had begun repeating it. They asked Denise questions with this underlying expectation that she would confirm the story, that she would act as the secondary witness to validate the truth Angela was presenting. I remember Denise's quiet exasperation as she recounted the calls. "They think I was in on it, that I agreed with her version," she said softly. "I had to tell some of them the truth, but not everyone listens, and some of them are clearly trying to see if you'll let her back in." The audacity of it made my jaw ache. She wasn't just attempting to reinsert herself into my life, she was actively trying to manipulate my extended family to pressure me, to bend the past to her will. I could picture her, speaking in her calm, persuasive tone, layering the narrative so it sounded like selfless protection rather than the selfish erasure it had been. For a long moment, I just sat there, absorbing the implications. Every call, every question from relatives, every whispered assumption that had begun to make me uneasy now made sense. I was not simply being ignored or avoided, I was being framed. My story, the truth of how I had been forced out of my own childhood home, was being stolen all over again, but this time, it was under the guise of concern and protection. Denise reached over and squeezed my hand gently, as if to anchor me in the reality that at least someone in our family still understood what had really happened. I nodded slowly, my mind already starting to organize the next steps: how to confront this, how to protect myself, how to stop her from rewriting 13 years of my life. It was infuriating, it was exhausting, but at that moment, I realized just how far I would have to go to reclaim my narrative, and that this battle wasn't just about boundaries anymore, it was about truth. Denise took a deep breath and leaned back, the weight of what she was about to say palpable in the quiet kitchen. "There's something I've kept from you for years," she began, her voice careful, almost hesitant. I could tell this wasn't easy for her. She paused, gathering herself before continuing. "The night before you came home to those bags on the porch, your mother called me." My stomach sank instantly. I felt that familiar tension creeping back, the one I'd first felt when I realized the life I'd known was gone. Denise continued, explaining that Angela had asked her directly if she would take me permanently. Not temporarily, not as a stopgap, but indefinitely. She had made it clear, in no uncertain terms, that she didn't want me brought back. There was no room for negotiation, no chance for compromise. Her intention was to remove me from the house completely. Hearing it now, all the fragments of that day, the porch, the bags, the way my mother had spoken so calmly, almost detachedly, fell into a sharper, more painful focus. It wasn't just a matter of rearranging living situations or letting a teenager stay elsewhere for a while. This had been premeditated, a deliberate act to erase me from her life entirely, and the conversation with Denise confirmed it. I could feel a tight, hot surge of emotion rising: anger, disbelief, hurt, but I tried to keep my voice steady as Denise recounted the details. "She was very clear," Denise said. "She didn't even want me to bring it up later or suggest that you might come back. She made it sound like this was the only option she considered acceptable." I sat back, letting the words wash over me. I remembered the helplessness of that afternoon at 15, standing there with the bags of my own belongings and the sudden realization that my home, the place I had known as mine, no longer included me. And now, after all these years, hearing Denise confirm the hidden truth made it even more concrete. This was never about Leonard being the reason. This was about my mother's choice, plain and simple. The kitchen felt smaller somehow, as if the air itself was charged with the weight of that confession. Denise reached out, touching my hand lightly. "I didn't tell you before because I wanted you to have your life, Marina," she said softly. "But now that she's resurfaced, you deserve to know what really happened." I nodded, swallowing hard, trying to manage the swirl of emotions: betrayal, clarity, the old ache of abandonment. This revelation didn't change the past. It only sharpened it, made it undeniable. For the first time, I could see the full scope of her decision, the deliberate nature of her absence, and the lengths she went to manipulate perception even in my absence. That moment shifted something inside me. The confusion, the self-doubt, the vague sense that maybe the story I'd been living wasn't the whole truth, it evaporated. Denise's words were a lens that finally focused everything, showing me the deliberate, conscious choices my mother had made. I understood now that nothing had been accidental, nothing had been a temporary lapse. It was a clean, calculated severing of ties. And in understanding that, I also realized how firmly I could now stand in my own truth, unshaken by the narratives anyone else tried to spin. Kayla and I sat across from Uncle Marcus in his dimly lit living room, the air thick with the kind of tension that comes from knowing someone you once trusted has been quietly scheming behind your back. It had taken a few days of subtle questioning and some nudges from Denise to finally corner him into a conversation we couldn't walk away from. I could feel my chest tightening as I began, my voice calm but firm, not leaving room for evasion. "Marcus, we need to know exactly what you've been telling family members about me and Mom," I said, keeping my hands clasped tightly in my lap. Kayla sat beside me, her eyes sharp and unwavering, silently backing me up. At first, he tried the usual deflection, shrugging, mumbling something about just trying to keep the peace, about family matters. But Kayla leaned forward, her tone crisp, cutting through the excuses. "Don't lie to us. We know you've been advising her," she said. "We know she's been rewriting my story, trying to make everyone think you were the reason I was forced to move, and that she's been pressuring me to let her move into my apartment." For a moment, Marcus shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting to the floor. Then he sighed, finally letting a small admission slip. He explained how he had, over time, suggested ways Angela could present her story to the family, framing her absence as protective rather than neglectful. He admitted he thought it would make her more sympathetic, and he said this almost too casually, maybe it would encourage me to open my door to her again. The casualness of it hit me like a punch. He wasn't just quietly giving advice. He had been actively participating in the manipulation, helping my mother construct a narrative designed to pressure me into compliance. I could feel my jaw tighten, my hands trembling slightly as anger bubbled under my calm exterior. Kayla reached over and squeezed my shoulder, a subtle anchor, as I struggled to keep my voice steady. "And you thought this was okay?" I asked quietly, my words clipped, but each syllable carrying the weight of years of betrayal and absence. That manipulating my extended family, twisting my childhood, and trying to guilt me into giving her access to my home was acceptable. Marcus avoided my gaze, swallowing, muttering something about family loyalty and trying to help her out of loneliness. The audacity of it made my stomach churn. 13 years of silence, of birthdays and milestones passed without her, and now this, an orchestrated attempt to pressure me, to rewrite my history, all with his guidance. I could see Kayla's jaw tighten beside me. She was just as furious, just as disbelieving, and yet remarkably composed. I finally leaned back, exhaling slowly, forcing myself to hold on to the clarity of the moment. It wasn't just Angela's attempt at manipulation. It was a family conspiracy of convenience, a calculated effort to bend the truth and my boundaries. And now, confronted with the full scope of it, I could see that nothing about their strategy had been subtle. The discomfort on Marcus's face, the way he squirmed under our gaze, the faint defensiveness creeping into his posture. It was the confirmation of all I had suspected. By the time we stood up to leave, the atmosphere had shifted. We had the truth laid bare, and the power dynamics were clear. This wasn't about reconciliation or loneliness, it was about control, about rewriting history. And now, finally, I had all the evidence I needed to face Angela with certainty. I dialed her number with my hands steady, though my chest was tight, the memory of 13 years of absence weighing on me. When Angela answered, I could hear the familiar calmness in her voice, the same calm that had once helped her shrug me out of my own home as a teenager. "Hello, Marina," she said softly, almost as if nothing had happened. I took a deep breath and held my voice firm, deliberate, even as my fingers curled around the phone. "Angela, I need you to understand something clearly. 13 years ago, you abandoned a 15-year-old girl. You packed her things, sent her away, and then disappeared from her life. That isn't a story that changes because you decided it was inconvenient to be a parent or because you feel lonely now." There was a pause on the line. I could hear her inhale sharply, a subtle crack in the surface composure she'd always held. I pressed on, keeping my tone even but unyielding. "What you've been telling people about protecting me from Leonard, about sending me away as if it was some act of heroism, that's not what happened. You left. You left me with no explanation, no support, and no acknowledgement of your own choice to put a boyfriend ahead of your child. Loneliness doesn't erase that." 13 years of silence doesn't suddenly make you a hero in the story of my life. Her voice wavered slightly. Marina, she started, but I cut in gently, firmly, not raising my tone but letting the weight of every word land. I'm not debating your feelings or your regrets. I'm telling you what actually happened. And that version of events you've tried to sell, trying to guilt relatives, trying to pressure me, that stops here. I have a life now. I built it quietly, carefully, from scratch. My home is my sanctuary, my life is stable, and my boundaries are non-negotiable. You do not have a place in that life simply because you want one now. There was a long silence on the line. I could hear her breathing, the subtle shift from defensiveness to disbelief, the almost imperceptible click of understanding that she had miscalculated. It wasn't a reconciliation, and it wasn't a conversation about forgiveness. It was a declaration. I was no longer available to be rewritten into her narrative. I ended the call calmly, placing the phone down with a sense of finality I hadn't felt in years. The quiet in my apartment was deep, comforting, every corner of it a reflection of my own choices, my own work, my own life. No one could undermine that now. I leaned back in my chair, letting myself exhale fully for the first time in decades. This was the life I had built. This was the boundary I had enforced. And in that clarity, there was power, an irrevocable shift from the past into a present that belonged entirely to me. Thank you for watching. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do so and hit the notification bell to stay updated with more shocking real-life stories happening around you.